Battle echoes at Gettysburg. I treated the bloodiest soil in American history like a theme park. I came for the history, mocking the ghost tours and the superstitious dread that clings to this place. By day, Gettysburg is deceptive. Rolling hills and restored cannons pointing at empty fields. But when the sun dips below the horizon, the silence gains weight. It presses against your eardrums, demanding to be heard. I stayed past closing. The wind shifted, carrying the impossible, stinging stench of sulfur and rot. Then came the sound, not the rustle of leaves, but the wet, tearing noise of metal meeting flesh. I raised my camera, expecting a reenactor. Instead, I captured the nightmare of a war that refuses to die.
I don't scare easily. That's not a boast, it's a defect. Where others feel the prickle of gooseflesh or the instinctive tightening of the gut, I usually feel a detached, clinical curiosity. That is why I came to Pennsylvania. I wanted to stand on the ground where the Union dissolved and reformed in a crucible of iron and blood. I wanted to understand the mathematics of slaughter. Gettysburg is a strange paradox. By day, it is a manicured park, a place of bright green manicured lawns and asphalt ribbons winding through the woods. It is sanitized. Families in minivans cruise past the wheat field, eating ice cream cones while looking at the spot where men were once mowed down in rows, so thick you could walk across the dead without touching the ground. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. I arrived in the late afternoon, the July sun hanging heavy and humid over the valley. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed against the back of the neck. Cicadas screamed from the tree lines, a frantic electric buzz that seemed to vibrate the very air. I spent hours walking the lines, tracing the movements of troops long since turned to dust. I touched the hot iron of the Napoleons, the bronze cannons, their barrels now silent, pointed vaguely at the distant tree line of Seminary Ridge. It felt peaceful, deceptively so. As the afternoon wore on, the tourists began to filter out. The minivans retreated to the hotels and buffet lines in town. The reenactors, sweating in their wool coats, packed up their muskets and drove away in Toyotas and Fords. The sun began its descent, bleeding a bruised purple across the western sky, casting long, warped shadows behind the marble obelisks and stone soldiers that dotted the landscape. I should have left. The park closes at sunset. But I wanted to see it without the distraction of the living. I wanted the silence. I moved my car to a small gravel turnout near the peach orchard, hidden from the main road by a copse of scrub oak. I sat on the hood, drinking lukewarm water, watching the light fail. The transition from day to night at Gettysburg isn't gradual. It feels like a door slamming shut. By 9 p.m., the darkness was absolute. The moon was obscured by a thick blanket of low-hanging clouds that had rolled in from the mountains, suffocating the starlight. The air grew still. The frantic buzzing of the cicadas cut out all at once, as if a switch had been thrown.
The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was a presence. I hopped off the hood of my car, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel. The sound seemed too loud, an intrusion on a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I walked toward the rail fence bordering the field. The grass, black in the night, rippled. There was no wind. I frowned, squinting into the gloom. The tall stalks of grass were bending, flattening in waves, as if invisible boots were tramping through them. The air temperature plummeted. It wasn't a cool breeze. It was the icy, stagnant cold of a meat locker. The hair on my arms stood up. Not from fear, I told myself, but from the thermal shock. Then came the smell. It hit me like a physical blow, acrid and sharp. It was the stench of sulfur, black powder smoke, mixed with something far worse, copper, the wet metallic tang of fresh blood, and beneath that, the sweet, cloying odor of rot. It was the smell of a field hospital in August, magnified 1,000 times. I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my sleeve, my eyes watering. "What the hell?" I whispered. My voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the dark. The wind moved across the grass again. It sounded like a sigh, a collective exhale of the earth itself, releasing a breath it had held for 160 years. Thump. I froze. It was distant, low frequency. It vibrated in my sternum more than it registered in my ears. Thump. Closer. It sounded like a heartbeat, or perhaps a heavy crate being dropped on soft earth. I scanned the horizon, my heart rate beginning to sync with the rhythm of the noise. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Fireworks? A car backfiring in town? Thunder? Boom. The third sound wasn't a thump. It was the distinct earth-shaking roar of artillery. It didn't come from the town. It came from the ridge directly across from me. I saw a flash, not the bright electric white of lightning, but a dirty, dull orange flare that illuminated the smoke for a fraction of a second. But there had been no smoke a moment ago. Now, looking across the field, I saw a low-hanging fog coalescing around the restored cannons. The fog churned, gray and angry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were trembling, defying my command to stay steady. I swiped to the camera app, the screen's glow blinding me for a second. I hit record. "Is anyone out there?" I called out.
The silence that answered me was broken by a sound that chilled the marrow of my bones. It started as a low murmur, a confusing babble of voices, like a crowded room heard through a thick wall. Then it sharpened. A scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in horror movies. It wasn't theatrical. It was short, wet, and abruptly cut off. It was the sound of a lung collapsing, then another, then a chorus of them. Raw, panicked agony. The sounds of men calling for their mothers, the sounds of men realizing they were dying in the dark. The audio on my phone spiked, the waveform bar turning red. I took a step back toward the car, my historical curiosity evaporating into a primal need to be anywhere else. Then, the drums started. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. Slow, heavy, a funeral cadence. The fog in the field began to rise, taking shape. It wasn't just mist anymore. The swirling vapors were condensing, hardening into vertical lines, into columns. I stared at the screen of my phone, using it as a viewfinder to pierce the darkness. Through the digital lens, the field wasn't empty. Shadows were detaching themselves from the tree line.
Chapter 2. The Hollow Men. I lowered the phone, my eyes straining against the gloom. The digital screen had shown me shadows, but my naked eyes found something solid. About 20 yards away, standing near the wheel of a brooding Napoleon cannon, was a man. The relief hit me so hard my knees almost buckled. The adrenaline that had been spiking in my blood curdled instantly into irritation. Of course, it wasn't ghosts. It wasn't a tear in the fabric of time. It was a reenactor, some hardcore history buff who had decided to camp out or practice his drills under the cover of darkness to avoid the park rangers. The rational world reassembled itself. The smell of sulfur, probably black powder from an illicit firing demonstration. The screaming, a recording, or maybe just some kids messing around in the woods. I took a breath, trying to slow my heart rate, and stepped away from my car. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots, but the figure didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his back to me, facing the open expanse of the wheat field. He was dressed in a dark frock coat, Union blue, though in this light it looked black, with a forage cap pulled low. He leaned slightly on a musket, the bayonet catching a glint of the non-existent moonlight. "Excuse me," I called out. My voice was steadier than I felt, laced with the annoyance of a tourist whose evening had been spooked by a LARPer. "You know the park is closed, right?" The figure didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. The heavy wool of his coat hung motionless, despite the sudden, unnatural stillness of the air. I took a few more steps closer. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Slowly, painfully, he began to turn. It wasn't a fluid motion. It was jerky, mechanical, like a marionette with tangled strings. As he pivoted, the air around him seemed to warp, growing colder, sharpening that copper blood stench until it coated the back of my throat. When he finally faced me, the irritation died in my throat, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. He was young, terrifyingly young, maybe 18, maybe younger. But his face was aged by a weariness that no living person should possess. His skin wasn't just pale, it was the color of old parchment, dusted with a fine layer of gray ash and grime. His lips were blue, cracked and dry. But it was his eyes that froze me. They were wide open, staring, but there was no light behind them. They were hollow, glassy voids that looked through me.
"Look, buddy," I stammered, my instinct to flee warring with my brain's refusal to accept what I was seeing. My gaze dropped from his face to his chest. The dark blue wool of his uniform was matted and wet in the center. Right over the sternum, the fabric was torn away, revealing a jagged, puckered hole the size of a silver dollar. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't corn syrup and latex. It was a cavern of ruined flesh, black and oozing, piercing straight to the other side. I could see the faint gray of the cannon wheel through his torso. The silence stretched, agonizing and taut. The soldier opened his mouth, his jaw unhinged slightly, dropping lower than it should have. I braced myself for a groan, a plea for help, a threat. No words came out. Instead, a sound rushed from his throat, a high, whistling wheeze. It was the sound of wind howling through a cracked window pane, the sound of air rushing into a vacuum. It was the voice of the grave. The sound vibrated in my teeth. I took a step back, my heel catching on a stone. The whisper formed within the wind, unintelligible at first, then sharpening into coherence. But his lips didn't move to form the syllables. The sound just existed. Behind him, the darkness of the field began to churn. The fog I had seen earlier spiked upward, twisting into human shapes. One by one, they solidified. Rows of them, a phalanx of gray and blue, indistinguishable in the night, rising from the grass like a crop of iron. "Oh God," I whispered. The soldier in front of me didn't blink. He just kept staring, that awful whistling wind pouring from his open mouth. Then the army behind him began to march. There was no sound of footsteps now, no crunch of grass, just the visual impossibility of motion. They moved in perfect locked-step formation, a wall of dead men advancing toward the road. I watched paralyzed as the front line reached the battery of cannons. Physics dictated they should stop, they should walk around. They didn't. The soldiers walked through the iron guns. Their bodies turned misty and translucent as they passed through the solid metal barrels and wooden wheels, then re-solidified on the other side. They were phasing through the world of the living, as if it were nothing more than smoke. They were coming toward me. Crack! The sound of a rifle shot exploded right beside my ear.
It was so loud, so violent, that I felt the pressure waves slap against my cheek. I flinched, covering my head, expecting to feel the burn of a bullet. Crack, crack, crack. The air around me erupted into a cacophony of invisible gunfire. Muzzle flashes popped in the empty air like strobes, dirty orange sparks that vanished instantly, leaving no smoke, no smell of powder, only the ringing in my ears.
I saw a soldier in the second rank jerk violently, his head snapping back as if struck by an invisible hammer. He didn't fall. He just kept marching, part of his face missing, his eyes still fixed forward. This wasn't a haunting. This was a loop, a recording of violence etched into the atmosphere, playing back at maximum volume, and I was standing in the middle of the kill zone. The young soldier with the hole in his chest took a step toward me. He raised a hand, his fingers dark with dried blood. "Run," the wind whispered. The command bypassed my brain and went straight to my legs. I spun around, my boots slipping on the gravel, scrambling for the car door. The handle felt freezing cold, burning my palm. I yanked it open and threw myself into the driver's seat, the sanctuary of the modern world. I slammed the door, sealing myself inside the glass and steel bubble. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the keys 3 times before jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting a twin path through the darkness. I didn't look back. I threw the gear shift into drive and floored it, tires spinning and spitting gravel as the car fishtailed onto the asphalt. I drove fast, the speedometer climbing past 60 on the winding park roads, risking a wreck just to put distance between me and that field. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. Only when I reached the edge of the town, where the streetlights cast a reassuring, artificial orange glow, did I dare to look in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. The field was silent, but the cold remained in the car, a deep, settling chill that the heater couldn't touch. I drove straight home, 3 hours of white-knuckle terror on the interstate. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just needed to get to my apartment, to the safety of lights and locks. It wasn't until I was inside, the deadbolt thrown, a glass of whiskey trembling in my hand, that I remembered the phone. I had been recording.
I set the glass down and pulled the phone from my pocket. It felt heavy, like a lead weight. My finger hovered over the gallery icon. I didn't want to see it. I wanted to delete it. I wanted to believe I had hallucinated the whole thing from heat stroke or exhaustion. But I had to know. I pressed play.
Chapter 3: Digital Ghosts. The whiskey glass left a wet ring on my coffee table, the condensation weeping onto the wood. My apartment was a fortress of modern comfort. Track lighting, noise-canceling windows, the hum of the HVAC unit. It was 3 hours and a century away from the Pennsylvania Turnpike. I should have felt safe. But the silence in my living room felt different now. It was thin, brittle. I held the phone with both hands, my thumbs hovering over the screen. The thumbnail for the last video was just a black square, a void captured in megabytes. I took a long pull of the whiskey, the burn reassuringly real, and tapped the screen. Play. The video opened with a burst of static, a digital tearing sound that made me flinch. Then the image stabilized. On the small screen, the night at Gettysburg was darker than I remembered. The camera's sensor had struggled with the low light, rendering the grass as a shifting sea of grainy noise. Is anyone out there? My voice on the recording sounded tinny, pathetic, a small animal chirping in a canyon. Then came the silence. In the room with me, the air conditioner cycled off. The sudden quiet in the apartment amplified the audio coming from the phone speakers. The sound was clearer on the recording. It wasn't just wind. It was layered. Beneath the high-pitched whistling, there was a wet, rhythmic sucking sound. The sound of a chest wound trying to pull in air. I watched the screen as the camera panned. In my memory, this was when I had seen the reenactor, the man in the frock coat. I leaned in, squinting. There was no one there. The wheel of the Napoleon cannon was visible, gray and solid in the gloom. But the space where the soldier had stood, where I had looked him in the eye, where I had seen the bullet hole, was empty. No, I whispered, a cold prickle starting at the base of my spine. He was right there. I scrubbed the video back, played it again. Empty space. Just a cannon in the waving grass. But as I watched the empty spot, the video began to artifact. Blocks of pixels smeared and dragged across the screen.
the image distorted, bending around a negative space. The camera hadn't captured light reflecting off a solid object. It had captured the absence of light, a human-shaped void in the digital grain. Then, on the video, the camera jerked. This was the moment I had started to run. The perspective tumbled wildly. Flashes of the ground, the sky.
Then, for 2 seconds, the image stabilized. In my panic to flee, I must have hit the icon to flip the camera lens. The darkness behind my head was teeming with white, translucent shapes. They were stacked in rows, a dense wall of spectral static, hundreds of them. They weren't just standing, they were surging forward, a tidal wave of gray mist and misery. And there, right over my left shoulder, was the face of the young soldier. He wasn't a void anymore. The camera had stripped away the illusion of flesh and captured the energy beneath. His face was a skull, overlaid with a faint glowing map of veins. The hollow eyes were 2 pits of absolute blackness, and he was looking directly into the lens. Not at the me in the video. He was looking at me, sitting on my couch, 3 hours away. He smiled. The skin of his jaw tore as the lips stretched too wide, revealing teeth that looked like jagged shards of slate. The video froze. It didn't pause. The app didn't crash. The image just locked, that dead, smiling face burning into the OLED display. A sharp electric crack snapped through the room. My phone went black. It was hot, searingly hot. I dropped it, yelping as it clattered onto the hardwood floor. It lay there, a dead slab of glass and lithium, smoke curling faintly from the charging port. Jesus, I hissed, clutching my burned hand. I stood up, backing away from the phone as if it were a venomous snake. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that echoed the cadence I had heard in the field. Thump. I froze. The sound hadn't come from my chest. Thump. It came from the hallway, outside my apartment door. It was heavy, dull sound, the sound of a boot heel striking the floorboards, but not a modern shoe. It was the heavy, flat slap of a broken. My rational mind tried to fire back. It's the neighbors. It's the building settling. You're in shock. Then the smell hit me. It didn't waft in gradually. It saturated the room in an instant, displacing the smell of my whiskey and the lemon scent of the floor cleaner. Sulfur. Thick, choking black powder smoke, and beneath it, the sweet, glowing copper tang of the slaughterhouse. The air in the living room turned frigid. The condensation on my whiskey glass froze, turning to white frost that crept up the sides of the tumbler. Thump. The sound was right outside the door now. I stared at the heavy wooden door, the deadbolt I had locked so securely. It was a solid barrier. It was meant to keep out burglars, not history. The brass doorknob turned. Slowly, grindingly slow. It rattled against the lock. "Go away," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're not real." The rattling stopped. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. Then a sound came from the other side of the wood. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of fabric brushing against the grain, like a wool coat leaning against the door. Then came the voice. It didn't come through the door. It didn't come through the air. It bloomed inside my skull, a headache made of sound. It was the same whistling wind, the same wheezing vacuum I had heard on the battlefield. The line must hold.
The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. My breath plumed in front of me, a white fog in the living room. I scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into semi-darkness, lit only by the streetlights filtering through the blinds. In the shadows of the corner, near the hallway entrance, the darkness began to thicken. It swirled, coalescing into a vertical column. The same gray fog, the same angry mist. They weren't just outside. I grabbed my car keys from the bowl on the counter. I didn't think. I didn't plan. The primal lizard brain took over, screaming one singular command: move. I bolted for the back door, the fire escape. I threw it open, stumbling out into the humid night air of the city. The noise of traffic, of sirens, of life, washed over me. I ran down the metal stairs, my boots clanging, echoing like cannon fire in the alleyway. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked on the street. I sat in the driver's seat, locking the doors, shivering violently, despite the summer heat. I looked up in my apartment window. The lights were out, but in the window, silhouetted against the gloom of the room, a figure stood watching. He was wearing a forage cap. I didn't sleep. I drove. I drove aimlessly for hours, afraid to stop, afraid to look in the mirror. But as the sun began to bleach the sky gray, a grim realization settled over me, heavier than the exhaustion. Running hadn't worked. Distance hadn't worked.
I had brought something back with me. Or rather, I had become a beacon. There was only one place to go, one place where this ended. I turned the car around. I was going back to Gettysburg.
Chapter 4: The Keeper of the Dead. The drive back to Pennsylvania was a blur of asphalt and paranoia. I didn't turn on the radio. I couldn't risk hearing the static resolve into screams again. Instead, I listened to the hum of the tires and the rhythmic thump-thump of the expansion joints on the highway, praying they wouldn't synchronize into the beat of a drum. Every shadow stretching across the turnpike looked like a prone body. Every roadside tree looked like a sentry standing guard. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth. The light was flat and gray, filtered through a high, bruised layer of clouds that seemed to follow me from the city. I arrived in Gettysburg just as the town was waking up. The contrast was nauseating. Store owners were sweeping sidewalks. A group of Boy Scouts was gathering near the town square, laughing and adjusting their backpacks. Flags snapped crisply in a breeze that felt normal, smelling of exhaust and coffee. They didn't know. They were walking on a graveyard, oblivious to the strata of agony beneath their feet. I drove straight to the visitor center. I looked like hell, unshaven, wearing the same clothes from the night before, my eyes bloodshot and rimmed with dark circles. I bypassed the museum exhibits, the cyclorama, and the gift shop full of kepis and toy muskets. I needed answers, not souvenirs. I found the information desk. A young volunteer looked up, her smile faltering as she took in my appearance. "I need to speak to a ranger," I said. My voice was raspy, like I'd been swallowing smoke. "Someone who knows the history, the real history." She hesitated, glancing at a door behind the desk. "Sir, the rangers are preparing for the morning programs. Is there something specific?" "Just get someone," I snapped, too loud. The Boy Scouts nearby went quiet. "Please." 5 minutes later, I was sitting on a bench outside, away from the crowds. A man in the gray and green uniform of the National Park Service sat next to me. He was older, his face weathered like cured leather,
with deep creases around eyes that had seen too many tourists and perhaps too many sunsets on these fields. His name tag read Harrison. He listened quietly as I described everything. I didn't hold back. I told him about the sudden silence, the smell of sulfur, the reenactor who wasn't a reenactor, the bullet hole, the video that showed the empty space and the face that shouldn't exist. I told him about the soldier in my apartment window.
I expected him to call security. I expected him to ask if I was on medication. Instead, Harrison just nodded slowly, staring out at the manicured lawn where a family was taking a selfie. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. "There were no reenactments last night," he said softly. The confirmation hit me like a physical weight. I knew it, but hearing it from an official source severed the last lifeline to rationality. "I checked the logs," Harrison continued, his voice low and gravelly. "No permits issued, no groups scheduled. The park was empty by sunset." "Then what did I see?" I demanded, my hands trembling on my knees. "Who was he?" Harrison took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "You know how many men died here in 3 days? Over 7,000 killed outright, another 30,000 wounded. Many of them didn't make it home. They were buried where they fell, in shallow graves, wrapped in blankets or nothing at all." He turned to look at me, his gaze piercing. "The past doesn't rest here, son. It just waits." "He followed me," I whispered, "to the city. He was in my window." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "You invited him." "I did no such thing." "You filmed him," Harrison corrected. "You tried to capture him. You looked through a lens instead of your own eyes. Mirrors, cameras, they act as doors. You opened a door, and you didn't close it behind you." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The peach orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den. These aren't just names on a map. They are scars. The violence was so intense, so concentrated, that it stained the bedrock. Most people just feel a little chill. Some get a headache. But you have a frequency. You tuned in." "How do I tune out?" I asked, desperate. "How do I make it stop?" Harrison sighed, looking back toward the distant tree line. "The soldier you described. Young, hole in the chest, ash on his face. Yes. Sounds like the 1st Minnesota, or maybe the 141st Pennsylvania. They took heavy losses in the orchard. If he's attached to you, it's because he thinks you're part of it now, part of the regiment. I'm not a soldier. I'm a software engineer. To them, you're just another soul on the field, and the battle isn't over for them. They are stuck in the loop, the infinite echo. If you want him to leave you be, you have to close the door. How? Go back."
He said. My stomach dropped. No way. You have to go back to where you saw him, exactly where you saw him. You have to tell him the war is over. You have to acknowledge him, not as a ghost, not as a curiosity for your phone, but as a man. And then you have to leave. You have to leave and never look back. Not in a mirror, not in a camera. You drive away and you keep your eyes forward until you cross the state line. Harrison stood up, putting his hat back on. The shadow of the brim hid his eyes. "But be careful," he added. "Tonight is the anniversary, July 2nd, the 2nd day of the battle. The fighting in the wheat field was chaotic, confused. If you go out there tonight, the veil will be thinner than paper." I watched him walk away, his boots crunching on the pavement. He moved with a stiff, heavy gait, and for a split second, the sunlight seemed to pass through his arm. I blinked, and he was solid again. I sat there for a long time.
The heat of the day was rising, but I was freezing cold. I had a choice. I could get in my car and drive to California. I could run until the ocean stopped me. But I knew with a sickening certainty that the soldier would be in the back seat. He would be in the mirror of every motel bathroom. He would be in the reflection of every dark window. Harrison was right. I had opened a door. I stood up. My legs felt like lead. I walked back to my car. I needed to wait for nightfall. I needed to prepare. I drove out of the visitor center lot, intending to find a diner, get some coffee, maybe try to stop my hands from shaking. I turned on to the Taneytown Road, heading away from the battlefield. I checked the rearview mirror to merge. For a split second, the back seat wasn't empty. The soldier was there, right there. He wasn't transparent this time. He was solid. The wool of his coat was thick and coarse. The smell of rot filled the compact car instantly, choking me. His face was inches from my neck. I could feel the cold radiating from him, a deep interstellar frost. He whispered, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. We never left the battlefield. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the shoulder. Horns blared behind me. I spun around in my seat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The back seat was empty. But on the gray upholstery, right where he had been sitting, was a stain, a dark, wet patch of fresh blood. And next to it, resting on the seat,
I wasn't leaving. I couldn't leave. I was already part of the formation. Chapter 5. The Lead Weight. I sat on the shoulder of the Taneytown Road for a long time, the hazard lights of my car clicking a rhythmic, synthetic heartbeat that failed to drown out the silence in my head. My hand was clenched tight. Inside my fist, the musket ball was freezing cold. It wasn't the ambient temperature of the air-conditioned car. It was the deep, geological cold of the grave. I opened my fingers slowly. The ball was heavy, deformed, a lump of lead the size of a marble that had been flattened on one side. It wasn't white with the oxidation of a century and a half in the dirt. It was dark, gray and greasy. It smelled of burnt tallow and black powder. It was fresh. I looked at the back seat. The bloodstain was soaking into the gray fabric, expanding like a Rorschach test of violence. It was bright arterial red, not the brown of old rust. Okay, I whispered. The words sounded foreign, like I was speaking underwater. Okay. I couldn't leave. Harrison, the Wanger, had been right. If I drove to California, I'd just be driving a hearse. The soldier was tethered to me, or I to him. The logic of the haunting didn't matter anymore. Only the rules of engagement did. I needed to wait for nightfall. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, a place with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed like an angry hornet. I requested a room on the ground floor, facing the parking lot. I needed a quick exit. The hours between noon and sunset were an exercise in psychological torture. I paced the small room, the carpet worn thin by countless other travelers. I turned on the TV, but the noise was unbearable. Every laugh track sounded like a scream. Every commercial jingle sounded like a fife. I turned it off.
I went into the bathroom to splash water on my face. I gripped the porcelain sink, staring down at the drain, breathing heavily. Don't look up. Harrison's warning echoed in my mind. Mirrors act as doors. I grabbed a towel from the rack and, without lifting my eyes, draped it over the mirror. I did the same for the long mirror on the closet door. I felt ridiculous, a grown man building a pillow fort against monsters. But the dread in the room was palpable. The air conditioner was set to 65, but I was sweating. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the musket ball. It was my talisman now, my cursed connection. I pulled out my laptop, avoiding the reflection in the screen until it powered on. I searched for the fighting in the peach orchard on July 2nd. The descriptions were clinical, but the horror bled through the text. General Sickles' salient, the wheat field, the slaughter pen. Men had been torn apart by canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells fired from cannons. The 141st Pennsylvania had lost nearly 70% of its men in minutes. Minutes. I looked at the clock. 7:45 p.m. The sun was beginning to dip. The golden hour. Photographers loved this light. But to me, it looked like the world was jaundice yellow, sick and dying. I packed my things. I didn't plan on coming back to the room. Whatever happened tonight, I would either drive away free or I wouldn't be driving at all. I got into my car. The blood stain on the back seat had dried to a crusty maroon scab. I threw a jacket over it. I couldn't look at it. The drive back to the battlefield was short, but the transition was absolute. As soon as I crossed the boundary of the national park, the atmosphere changed. The air pressure dropped. My ears popped. The sounds of the town, the traffic, the distant hum of civilization were severed, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The sun was gone now, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise, purples, and deep, angry blues. I navigated the winding park roads. There were no other cars, no joggers, no cyclists. It was as if the living had instinctively ceded the ground to the dead for the anniversary. I reached the gravel turnout near the peach orchard, the same spot as last night. I killed the engine. The silence rushed in to fill the cabin, heavy and suffocating. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I had to get out. I had to go to the spot where I had filmed him. I had to acknowledge him. Close the door. I took a deep breath, tasted copper, and opened the car door. I stepped out onto the gravel. It was louder tonight. Yesterday, the sounds had been distant, echoes carried on a wind that shouldn't exist. Tonight, the sounds were immediate. The air smelled so strongly of sulfur it burned my nostrils. It was a thick, choking fog of rotten eggs and charcoal. Thump, thump, thump. The ground beneath my boots vibrated. It wasn't a heartbeat this time. It was the rhythm of marching feet. Thousands of them. I walked toward the rail fence, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. The darkness was absolute, the moon hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds.
I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight, then stopped. No cameras, no lenses. I had to do this with my own eyes. I squinted into the gloom. The field ahead of me, the peach orchard, was not empty. The fog was back, but it wasn't hugging the ground. It was standing tall, swirling in columns, and within the fog, the shapes were clearer than before. I saw the silhouette of a cannon, its barrel depressed, and leaning against it, a figure. "I'm here," I said. My voice was a croak. I cleared my throat and tried again, louder. "I'm here." The figure by the cannon turned. It wasn't just one. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw them,
They were everywhere. To my left, kneeling behind the split-rail fence. To my right, lying prone in the tall grass, standing in formation in the open field. Hundreds of shadowy figures, their forms flickering like bad reception on an old TV set. They were translucent, glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. I could see the trees through their bodies. I could see the fence posts through their chests. But their faces were solid, and they were all looking at me. The figure by the cannon, the young man with the hole in his chest, stepped forward. He moved with that same jerky, stop-motion animation. He stopped 10 feet away. The cold radiating from him hit me like a physical wave, freezing the sweat on my forehead. He raised a hand. He wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing behind me. "The line," he whispered. The sound wasn't wind anymore. It was a voice, a young, terrified voice, cracked with thirst and smoke. "The line is breaking." I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes on the threat in front of me. But the sound of tearing metal came from behind. Crunch! I spun around. My car. My modern steel and glass sanctuary. A cannonball, a solid black sphere of iron, had materialized out of the night and smashed into the hood of my sedan. Steam hissed violently from the crushed radiator. The windshield shattered into a spiderweb of diamonds. I stared, my brain unable to process the physics. A Civil War cannonball had just destroyed a 2020 Honda. "No," I whimpered. "That's not possible." "They are flanking us," the soldier whispered, his voice right in my ear now. I turned back to him. He was closer, inches away. I could see the gray stubble on his chin. I could see the terror in his hollow eyes. "You have to hold the line."
He shoved a heavy object into my chest. I instinctively grabbed it. It was cold, wooden stock, iron barrel, a musket. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in soot. I looked at my arms. The sleeves of my jacket were gone, replaced by dirty blue wool. Panic, absolute and primal, surged through me. I dropped the musket. It didn't hit the ground. It vanished before it touched the grass. I looked at my car again. It was gone. The gravel turnout was gone. The asphalt road was gone. There was only mud, churned bloody mud, and the air was filled with screaming.
Chapter 6: The Killing Box. The asphalt didn't just vanish, it dissolved. The solid reality of the 21st century, the yellow lane markers, the gravel shoulder, the comforting hum of the electric grid, liquefied into a slurry of red clay and blood. I fell to my knees. My hands sank into the mud, the cold slime oozing between my fingers. I scrambled, clawing at the earth, desperate to find the hard surface of the road, the metal chassis of my car, anything that belonged to my time. There was nothing but dirt. The silence I had experienced earlier was gone, replaced by a wall of noise so dense it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. It wasn't just the boom of cannons anymore. It was a cacophony of chaos, the terrified whinnying of horses, the splintering of wood, the wet thud of lead striking meat, and the screaming. God, the screaming. It was a continuous, undulating wave of human misery that drowned out my own thoughts. I looked up, gasping for air that tasted of sulfur and copper. The peach orchard was burning. Not the trees themselves, but the air around them seemed to be on fire. Flashes of orange and yellow ripped through the thick, choking smoke that blanketed the field. The restored cannons I had seen by day were gone. In their place were active batteries, their crews working with frantic, demonic speed. Men in sweat-stained shirts rammed charges down smoking barrels, covering their ears as the guns bucked and roared, spitting death into the darkness. "Get up!" A hand grabbed my collar, rough, calloused, and freezing cold. I was hauled to my feet. I stumbled, my legs feeling like jelly.
The man holding me was the young soldier, the one with the hole in his chest. Up close, the wound was horrific. The edges of the fabric were singed, and the flesh beneath was a ruin of black gore and exposed bone. But he didn't seem to notice. His eyes, those hollow, void-like eyes, were fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. "They're flanking the salient," he screamed. His voice had dry rasp that cut through the din. "Where's your musket, Private?" I don't," I stammered, backing away. I looked down at myself. The transformation wasn't a hallucination. My jeans and t-shirt were gone. I was wearing heavy, scratchy wool trousers that smelled of mildew and unwashed bodies. A leather belt dug into my waist. I felt the weight of a cartridge box on my hip. "I'm not a soldier," I yelled, the panic rising in my throat like bile.
"I am a tourist. I'm just watching." The young soldier didn't hear me, or he didn't care. He shoved me toward the rail fence. "Form up, they're coming through the wheat." I spun around, looking for an escape. I looked toward where the road should be. It was choked with retreating caissons and wounded men. A horse, its flank torn open by shrapnel, galloped past me, its eyes rolling in terror, dragging a broken limber behind it. There was no road. There was no visitor center. There was only the kill zone. I was standing in the middle of the peach orchard on the evening of July 2nd, 1863. I was standing in the center of the vortex. Harrison, the ranger, he said I had to acknowledge him. He said I had to close the door. "I see you," I screamed at the young soldier, grabbing his shoulders. His uniform was wet, soaking wet with blood that felt like ice water. "I see you. You're dead. The war is over. Let me go." The soldier blinked. For a second, the frantic energy in his face faltered. The hollow eyes focused on mine. A flicker of confusion crossed his pale, ash-dusted features. "Dead?" he whispered. The word hum in the air, heavy and impossible. Then a high-pitched, ululating shriek rose from the darkness beyond the fence line. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. The rebel yell. "Here they come," someone shouted from down the line. The darkness of the wheat field erupted in muzzle flashes. 1,000 fireflies blinked in unison, followed instantly by the angry buzz of mini balls tearing through the air. Thwack! 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 The sound of bullets hitting the fence posts and the men standing next to me was nauseatingly distinct. The soldier to my right, a bearded man who looked like he belonged on a daguerreotype, jerked violently. His head snapped back, a spray of dark mist erupting from his temple. He didn't fall immediately. He just stood there, dead on his feet, before crumpling into the mud. I felt a spray of something cold and wet hit my cheek. I wiped it away. My hand came away red. It wasn't warm. It was freezing. "Get down," the soldier yelled, tackling me. We hit the dirt together. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I lay there, face pressed into the bloody mud, gasping for breath. The air above us was alive with lead. I could hear the bullets snapping through the tall grass, sounding like angry hornets. "Why are you here?" the soldier hissed, his face inches from mine.
The smell of rot coming from his open mouth was overpowering. "You don't belong to the 141st. "I told you," I sobbed, clutching the dirt. "I'm from the future. I'm from now. I just wanted to see." "See?" He looked at me, his expression twisting into a mask of sorrow and rage. "You wanted to see?" He grabbed my hand and forced it against his chest, into the hole. I screamed, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron.
My fingers sank into the freezing, pulpy cavity of his torso. I could feel the shattered ribs. I could feel the absence of a heart. "Feel it," he commanded. "You came to watch. You came to take pictures. Now feel it." The cold shot up my arm, seizing my muscles. My vision began to tunnel. The noise of the battle seemed to warp, slowing down, deepening into a guttural roar. "We are trapped," he whispered, his voice vibrating in my bones. "And you stepped into the formation." "Let me go," I begged. "Please." "The line is breaking," he said, looking over the fence. I followed his gaze. Emerging from the smoke, marching with terrifying discipline, was a gray wall of Confederate infantry. They were translucent, like the others, but their bayonets gleamed with a cruel, hard light. They were phasing through the trees, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, inexorable and unstoppable. They weren't just reenacting a battle. They were reliving the moment of their deaths, and they were bringing it to me. "Run," the soldier said suddenly. He released my hand. "What?" "Run!" he screamed, shoving me backward. "Run to the ridge. If you stay here, you become part of the soil." I didn't wait. I scrambled backward, crab walking through the mud until I could get to my feet. I turned and ran. I ran blindly through the smoke, tripping over roots and bodies. I didn't know where the ridge was. I didn't know where safety was. I just knew I had to get away from that fence, away from that hole in the chest. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until the sounds of the musketry began to fade slightly behind me. I crashed through a line of bushes and stumbled onto a hard surface. Asphalt. I fell forward, skinning my palms on the rough road. I gasped, looking around. The smoke was thinner here. I saw the silhouette of a monument, a stone obelisk, looming in the dark. I was back. I was back on the park road. I scrambled to my feet, laughing hysterically. I made it! Oh God, I made it! I looked down at myself.
I was wearing my jeans, my t-shirt. My sneakers were muddy, but they were my sneakers. I spun around, looking back toward the peach orchard. The field was dark, silent. No fire, no screaming. Just the wind moving the grass. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, trembling with relief. It was over. I had acknowledged him, and I had run. I had closed the door. I turned to walk down the road, back toward town. I would walk all night if I had to. Then I saw it, parked on the side of the road, about 50 yards ahead. My car, the 2020 Honda. It looked pristine. No crushed hood, no shattered windshield. I froze. I had watched a cannonball destroy that car 10 minutes ago. I walked toward it slowly, dread pooling in my stomach again. As I got closer, I saw someone sitting in the driver's seat. The dome light was on. I stopped 10 feet away, my breath catching in my throat. The person in the driver's seat was me. It was me, wearing the same clothes, holding my phone up, recording a video. I watched myself mouth the words, "Is anyone out there?" The me in the car turned and looked out the window. He looked right at me, but he didn't see me. He looked through me. And then I realized why the air was so cold, why I couldn't hear my own footsteps. I looked down at my chest. There was a hole in my t-shirt, a dark, jagged tear, right over my heart. And through it, I could see the asphalt of the road.
Chapter 7: The Severed Shadow. I stared at the hole in my chest. It wasn't bleeding. Not really. There was no spurting artery, no warm gush of life draining onto the asphalt. Instead, the wound was a jagged window into a void. Inside the torn fabric of my t-shirt and the ruined meat of my sternum, there was only a swirling gray mist. The same mist that hugged the ground of the peach orchard. I looked up, my vision blurring, not with tears, but with a strange, static-like grain.
But the part of you that watched, the part that recorded, he pointed a dirty finger at the hole in my chest. That part stayed. I'm dead, I said, the realization settling over me like a heavy wool blanket. Not dead, he corrected. Echoed. You are a memory now, just like us. I have to go back. There is no back, he said. There is only the line. Suddenly, the world shifted. The asphalt road beneath my feet didn't dissolve this time. It simply ceased to be relevant. The darkness of 2024 was stripped away, replaced by the suffocating, smoke-filled twilight of July 2nd, 1863. The noise returned instantly. The roar of the cannonade, the screams, the smell of sulfur and bowel. But this time it was different. Before, it had been a chaotic assault on my senses. Now it felt natural. It felt like the baseline reality. The silence of the modern park was the illusion. The screaming was the truth. "Form up," a sergeant shouted, his voice ragged. He was missing an ear, the side of his head a mask of blood. I felt a pull, a physical tug in my gut, dragging me toward the fence line. It wasn't a choice. It was magnetism. I was iron, and the battle was the magnet. "I don't know how to fight," I yelled, drifting toward the line of spectral soldiers. "Doesn't matter," the young soldier said, walking beside me. "We don't fight to win anymore. We fight because we can't stop." He shoved a musket into my hands. This time, I didn't drop it. My translucent fingers gripped the stock. It felt solid, heavy, real. The wood was slick with sweat and grease. I looked down at myself. My jeans and t-shirt were gone. I was wearing the dark blue sack coat. The wool scratched my neck. The brogans pinched my feet. I reached up to my head and felt the rough fabric of a forage cap. I wasn't a tourist anymore. I was a recruit. "They're coming through the wheat field again," someone screamed. I looked over the rail fence. The field was a churning sea of gray ghosts. The Confederates were advancing, their rebel yell a piercing, discordant harmony that vibrated in my teeth. They weren't men. They were intent given form. They were a wave of violence that had been crashing against this ridge for 160 years. I raised the musket. My body moved without my permission. I bit the cartridge, tasting the bitter black powder, rammed down the barrel, and capped the nipple. The motions were fluid, practiced.
Aim. I leveled the heavy gun over the fence rail. Fire. I pulled the trigger. The kick into my shoulder was brutal, a solid punch that would have bruised living flesh. Flame spat from the muzzle, blinding me for a second. Through the smoke, I saw a Confederate soldier stumble. He grabbed his stomach, his face twisting in agony, and fell. He didn't hit the ground. He dissolved into mist before he landed. "Reload," the sergeant screamed. I reached for another cartridge,
My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a terrible, electric excitement. The adrenaline of the battle was flooding through me, replacing the blood I no longer had. "Is this it?" I shouted to the young soldier next to me. "Is this forever?" He didn't answer. He was staring past the enemy line, toward the road, toward the future. "He's getting away," the soldier whispered. I froze, the ramrod halfway down the barrel. "Who?" "You," he said. "The other you. The one who thinks he survived." A flash of vision assaulted me. It wasn't from my eyes. It was a remote view, grainy and dark. I saw the interior of my Honda. I saw the living me, shaking, driving fast down the highway. I saw him glance in the rearview mirror. I was seeing through the rearview mirror. I was in the back seat. The connection was instantaneous and sickening. I was here, loading a musket in the mud, but I was also there, sitting in the dark upholstery of the car, dripping spectral blood onto the seat. I felt the living me sphere. It was delicious. It was a beacon. "He's leaving us," the young soldier said, his voice dropping to a growl. "He's going to forget. He's going to go home and drink his whiskey and delete the video and pretend this is just a story." Rage flared in my chest, hotter than the cannon fire. How dare he? How dare he drive away and leave me here in the cold? How dare he live while I rot in this loop? "No," I hissed. The word echoed in the car on the highway, miles away. "Tell him," the soldier urged. "Tell him we are still here." I focused my will. I reached across the miles, across the decades, across the barrier between the quick and the dead. I projected myself into that back seat. I made the air in the car freeze. I made the smell of sulfur fill his lungs. I leaned forward, close to his ear. I saw his eyes widen in the mirror. I saw the terror that I had felt, that he was feeling. I opened my mouth.
We never left the battlefield. The living me slammed on the brakes. The connection snapped. I was back in the peach orchard. The vision faded. "Good," the young soldier said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "He knows now. He carries the weight." "Why?" I asked, trembling. "Why torment him?" "Because," the soldier said, raising his own musket as the gray wave crashed against our fence. "If he forgets us, we disappear, and we are not ready to sleep." A bayonet lunged out of the smoke, aiming for my throat. I parried it with my musket, screaming a war cry that wasn't mine. I wasn't just a victim of the haunting anymore. I was the haunter.
Chapter 8, The Tether. I was doing 80 on Route 15, the Honda's engine whining in protest. The digital speedometer was a glowing green eye in the darkness, the only thing that felt anchored in reality. Outside, the Pennsylvania countryside was a blur of black trees and shadows that seemed to stretch like grasping fingers toward the asphalt. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped. I was escaping. I was leaving the battlefield behind. But I wasn't alone. The air in the car was frigid. I had the heater blasted to the max, the fans roaring, but my breath still plumed in white clouds that fogged the windshield. The cold wasn't coming from the vents. It was radiating from the back seat. I refused to look in the rearview mirror. I had angled it up toward the ceiling liner the moment I peeled out of that gravel turnout. I didn't want to see the stain. I didn't want to see the soldier. But I didn't need eyes to know he was there. A sharp, searing pain erupted in my right shoulder. I screamed, the car swerving into the left lane. It felt like someone had just punched me with a sledgehammer,
My arm went numb, dead weight flopping against the door panel. "Jesus," I gasped, grabbing my shoulder with my left hand. There was no blood, no bruise, but the bone deep inside ached with a phantom recoil. "Reload," a voice whispered in my head. It wasn't an auditory hallucination. It was a thought that wasn't mine, inserted directly into my frontal cortex. It came with a sensory overlay, the taste of bitter, salty gunpowder on my tongue, the gritty texture of a paper cartridge between my teeth. "Ram it down, quick boys, they're reforming." My hands, my living hands on the steering wheel began to tremble uncontrollably. I wasn't just driving a car anymore. I was simultaneously standing in a muddy field, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against ribs that felt too thin to protect me. I was bilocating. The part of me that had stayed behind, the echo I had created by looking too long into the abyss, wasn't just a passive recording. It was active, it was fighting, and because I was the source, I was the battery powering its existence. Thump. A heavy impact against the back of my driver's seat, like a knee pressing into the upholstery. "Stop it," I yelled, slamming my hand against the dashboard. "I'm not there. I'm here. I'm going home." "We never go home," the voice rasped. It sounded like me, but aged 50 years in 10 minutes. The line must hold.
The headlights of an oncoming semi-truck washed over me. For a split second, the illumination broke the spell. I was just a guy in a car, fleeing a national park. Then the truck passed, and the darkness rushed back in, heavier than before. I needed to stop. I needed coffee. I needed bright fluorescent lights and human voices. I saw a sign for a gas station 2 miles ahead. I took the exit ramp too fast, the tires squealing. I pulled into the deserted lot of a 24-hour Sunoco. The overhead lights were buzzing, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the concrete. I threw the car into park and scrambled out, tripping over my own feet. The humid night air hit me, warm and thick with the smell of gasoline. It should have been a relief. It wasn't. As I stood there, panting, hands on my knees, I looked down at my shirt. My gray t-shirt was soaked, not with sweat. A dark, wet stain was spreading across my chest, right over the sternum. I touched it. My fingers came away red. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I tore the shirt up, frantically checking my skin. There was no wound. The skin was unbroken, pale and clammy. But the blood was there. It was seeping through my skin, manifesting from the inside out. Stigmata of a battle I hadn't fought yet. I ran toward the convenience store. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me I was crazy. The automatic door slid open with a cheerful ding-dong. The clerk was a teenager with headphones around his neck, leaning over a textbook. He didn't look up. "Hey," I croaked. "Hey, I need..." The words died in my throat. The clerk looked up. His face was gone. Where his eyes and nose should have been, there was only a smooth, flat surface of bone. No features, no humanity, just a blank slate. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, the sound of snare drums filled the small store. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. I stumbled back, knocking over a display of chips. Bags of Doritos exploded across the floor. "No," I whispered. "Not here. You can't be here." The shelves behind the clerk began to dissolve. The rows of candy bars and cigarettes faded, replaced by the dark looming silhouettes of trees. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, replaced by the orange glow of muzzle flashes. I wasn't in a gas station. I was in the woods near Culp's Hill. "Form square. Cavalry." The shout came from my left. I spun around. The glass doors of the store were gone, in their place.
A horse and rider charged out of the darkness. The horse was massive, its eyes rolling white with terror, foam flying from its mouth. The rider swung a saber that gleamed with a wicked spectral light. The blade slashed down. I threw myself to the floor, the linoleum floor of the gas station. I hit the ground hard. The smell of floor wax returned. The buzzing lights flickered back on. The clerk was standing over me, looking terrified. He had a face, he had eyes, he was holding his phone. "Sir, are you okay? I'm calling 911. I scrambled backward, crab walking away from him. Don't call them. If the police came, they would keep me here. They would put me in a cell, and in a cell, there is nowhere to run. The walls would become the wheat field. The bars would become bayonets. I'm fine, I lied, scrambling to my feet. Just low blood sugar, I'm leaving. I ran out of the store before he could stop me. I got back into my car, the sanctuary, the coffin. I locked the doors. I looked at the passenger seat. Resting there on the fabric was a kepi, a Civil War forage cap. It was battered, stained with grease, and possessed a bullet hole through the crown. It hadn't been there when I parked. I picked it up. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. Inside the brim, written in faded ink, was a name. My name. Not the name of some ancestor. My name. My handwriting. I threw the cap into the back seat. "Let me go," I screamed, pounding the steering wheel. "I acknowledged you. I ran. What more do you want?" I looked in the rearview mirror. I couldn't help it. The back seat was crowded now. It wasn't just the young soldier. There were 3 of them. The young one with the chest wound, an older man with half a face, and a drummer boy who couldn't have been more than 12, his eyes weeping black tears. They were squeezed into the back of my Honda, their uniforms pressing against each other, muskets held upright between their knees. They weren't looking at me. They were looking out the back window. "They are gaining on us," the older one said. His voice was a wet gurgle. "Who?" I whimpered. The young soldier, the one who was me, leaned forward. His face appeared between the front seats, right next to my shoulder. The smell of rot was unbearable. "The rear guard," he whispered. "We broke the line, we ran, and now the dead are chasing the deserters." He pointed a gray finger at the windshield. "Drive. If you stop."
I looked out the windshield. The road ahead wasn't Route 15 anymore. It was a narrow dirt track, hemmed in by stone walls. And blocking the way, standing silently in the headlights, was a figure on a pale horse. He wore a gray uniform, he held a pistol, and he was waiting for me.
Chapter 9. The Provost Marshal. The figure on the pale horse did not move. In the high beams of my Honda, the horse looked less like an animal and more like a sculpture carved from bone and moonlight. Its ribs were visible through its translucent hide, and steam, cold blue vapor, snorted from its nostrils. The rider sat tall in the saddle, wearing a long gray coat that hung motionless despite the swirling wind. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a slouch hat, but the pistol in his hand was leveled directly at my windshield. "Run him down," the young soldier in my backseat screamed. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a frantic, terrifying shriek right in my ear. "If we stop, we hang." "I can't," I yelled, my foot hovering over the brake. "It's a man, it's a horse." "It is judgment," the older ghost gurgled, blood bubbling from his ruined jaw. "Drive, you coward, drive." The pistol in the rider's hand flashed. There was no sound of a gunshot, just the shattering of safety glass. My windshield exploded inward. I didn't feel a bullet. I felt a sudden crushing pressure in my chest, as if all the air had been sucked out of the cabin. The car swerved violently. I lost control. The steering wheel spun uselessly in my hands, disconnected from the tires, disconnected from reality. "No," I screamed. I slammed on the accelerator, not out of bravery,
but out of a spasm of pure animal panic. The engine roared, a mechanical scream that blended with the spectral drums pounding in my skull. The car surged forward, hurtling toward the pale horse. I braced for impact. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the crunch of metal on bone, the spray of blood, the end of everything. Wham! The impact was like hitting a wall of ice water. The car didn't crumble, it passed through. The sensation was agonizing. It felt like every molecule in my body was being pulled apart and stitched back together in the wrong order. The cold was absolute, a void of temperature that froze the scream in my throat. Then gravity returned with a vengeance. The car slammed down hard. The suspension snapped with a sickening metallic crack. The airbags deployed, not soft white pillows, but clouds of suffocating gray dust. I was thrown forward, the seatbelt cutting into my chest, knocking the wind out of me. The car skidded, metal shrieking against stone, spinning in a chaotic pirouette before coming to a violent halt. Silence. For a moment.
There was only the ringing in my ears and the hiss of the radiator. I coughed, waving away the dust. My head was spinning. I reached for the door handle. It was jammed. I slammed my shoulder against it, once, twice. It gave way with a groan of twisted metal. I fell out onto the ground. It wasn't asphalt. It wasn't the dirt road. It was mud, deep, sucking, blood-soaked mud. I scrambled to my hands and knees, retching. The smell was overpowering, sulfur, rot, and the copper tang of fresh slaughter. I looked up. My car was gone. In its place was a wrecked caisson, an ammunition wagon lying on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the air. The horses were dead, tangled in their traces. "Get up," a voice commanded. I froze. I looked around. I was in a hollow, surrounded by dark woods. The trees were shattered, their branches stripped away by artillery fire, leaving jagged stumps that pointed accusingly at the sky. Standing in a semicircle around me were men. They weren't the ghostly, translucent figures I had seen in the peach orchard. These men looked solid, heavy. They wore Union blue, but their uniforms were clean. Their brass buttons gleamed in the light of torches held by men in the rear. They held muskets with bayonets fixed, and in the center of the semicircle stood the rider. He had dismounted. He wasn't a Confederate. Up close, I saw the insignia on his shoulder straps, a major. He wore the sash of the provost marshal, the military police, the executioners. "Name?" the major asked. His voice was dry, like old paper tearing. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt swollen. I'm a tourist. I'm just... "Name and regiment," he barked. "Private William H. Sterling," a voice shouted from behind me. I spun around. The three ghosts from my back seat were standing there. They were on their knees, hands bound behind their backs with spectral rope. The young soldier, the one who looked like me, the one with the hole in his chest, was staring at the ground, weeping black tears. "We were flanked," the young soldier sobbed. "The line broke. We didn't run. We fell back." The major stepped forward. He looked at the ghosts. Then he looked at me. His eyes were terrible. They were mirrors. In them, I saw myself. But I wasn't wearing my jeans and t-shirt. I was wearing the uniform. I was dirty. I was bleeding. And my hands were bound behind my back. "You left the field," the major said softly. He drew his pistol.
It was a heavy Colt Army revolver. You abandoned your post. You abandoned your brothers. "I'm not him," I screamed, struggling against bonds I couldn't see but could definitely feel cutting into my wrists. "I'm from 2024. I live in an apartment. I drive a Honda. Look at the wreck. Look at it." I pointed to the overturned caisson. The major didn't look. There is no future for cowards. There is only the loop. He walked over to the older ghost, the one with the ruined jaw. "Desertion in the face of the enemy," the major intoned. He placed the barrel of the pistol against the ghost's forehead.
Bang! The sound was deafening. The ghost didn't fall. He dissipated. He exploded into a cloud of gray mist that was instantly sucked into the muddy ground. The drummer boy began to wail, a high, thin sound that grated on my nerves like a knife on glass. "Please," the boy cried. "I lost my drum. I was looking for my drum." "Silence," the major said. He stepped to the boy. Bang! Another cloud of mist. Another soul returned to the soil. Only the young soldier, my doppelganger, remained, and me. The major turned to the young soldier. "And you, Private Sterling," the major said. "You led them away. You opened the door." "I wanted to live," the soldier whispered, looking up. His hollow eyes met mine. "I just wanted to go home." "The battlefield is your home," the major said. He raised the pistol. "Wait," I shouted. "Don't shoot him." The major paused. He turned his head slowly to look at me. "Why?" he asked. "He is you. You are him. One of you ran. One of you died. But both of you left the line." "I didn't die," I insisted, tears streaming down my face. "I'm alive. I have a life." "Do you?" The major holstered his pistol. He stepped closer to me. The smell of him was ancient, dust and dried flowers. "You drove away, yes, but look at your chest." I looked down. The hole in my chest, the one I had seen in the reflection, was no longer a window into mist. It was bleeding. Real, bright, arterial blood was pulsing from the wound, soaking the wool of the uniform I was now undeniably wearing. "You took the bullet in the orchard," the major said. "You just didn't fall down. You kept running. You ran for 160 years. You ran all the way to a city of glass and light. But the bullet always catches up." He gestured to the young soldier kneeling in the mud. "He is the memory of the pain. You are the memory of the fear. And tonight—"
The circle closes. The major pulled a pocket watch from his coat. He clicked it open. The hands were spinning wildly, a blur of time. "It is time to rejoin the regiment," he said. He snapped the watch shut. "Form the firing squad." The line of soldiers behind him stepped forward, 12 muskets leveled at us, 12 black eyes of death staring me down. "No," I whispered. "I don't accept this." "Ready?" the major shouted. I looked at the young soldier. He had stopped crying. He looked peaceful. "It's okay," he whispered to me. "We don't have to run anymore." "Aim?" I struggled. I pulled at the invisible ropes. I kicked at the mud. I was not going to die in a history book. I was not going to be a ghost story told by rangers to tourists. Fire. The world turned white.